In our analysis of the 19th century, we come now to the theme of imperialism. Understand that the industrialization that we've already discussed and the nationalism provide a perfect recipe or ingredients for a recipe that's going to lead for overseas control to expand and intensify. And this is where we are with imperialism of the 19th century, the 1800s. Africa becomes a focus. We're going to center a lot of our attention here initially on Africa, simply because we've talked about it before, about its relationship with trade with Europe. We're going to see that with increased interaction with African traders, remember the age of exploration, exploration into the continent is going to be made available with technology, aided by technology and medicines, the steam engine, guns, and anti-malaria medicines. They're going to be able to actually go into, Europeans are going to be able to go into the continent now. That's going to, of course, allow them to recognize the many resources that are available for extraction and economic gain. Cultural and racial ideas about European superiority will fuel these actions. This is really just a continuation of what was already felt and considered by many Europeans when it comes to their standing and consideration of African populations. With better or advanced technology, the Europeans are going to be able to be equipped to move about and win conflicts and control. Wars are going to be very one-sided. Guns against spears and swords don't work out very well if you're holding the spears and swords. Important event to note would be the Berlin Conference of 1898. Europe was already in Europe by this, or Europe was already in Africa, by this time, by the mid and even into the later 1800s. But as we get to the climax or the ending of this 19th century, they're going to meet in Berlin and really divide up what will be held in Africa as they go into the 20th century. They are not going to be inviting Africa. They're going to be deciding who gets what, and of course, without consideration of what the Africans want and need in this relationship. The establishments of names and borders to identify control did not reflect long-standing cultural practices by the Africans or ethnic divisions in the continent. That's going to create problems not just during that day and age, but obviously as time goes on and these colonies and holdings of imperial control gain their independence, you're going to find that many African groups are put together who didn't necessarily make those choosings, and that's going to create conflict themselves down the road. European control will be met with opposition, obviously. The Africans were not just opening the door and said, come on in. There will be groups that are going to resist. We are reminded of Shaka Zulu, the chief of the Zulu nation in southern, or Zulu tribe in southern Africa. By the early 1800s, Shaka had used disciplined force to create a centralized state in the south. However, later rulers throughout the century were going to not be able to resist European control and withstand their forces. Even though they almost won battles against these European forces in the 1870s, by 1887 they would be totally under the control of British forces. European competition will lead to more conflict. Dutch farmers, known as Boers, will first settle in southern Africa in the mid-1600s. Also known as Afrikaners, they will clash with British as Great Britain will take this Cape Colony in the early 1800s. The Boers will, of course, then move northward and will be continuing to clash with people from the continent of Africa. So conflict will be begetting conflict, of course, on the continent. As gold and diamonds will be found in the region in the 1860s and 80s, the Boers will try to keep others out. However, increased conflict with the Brits and the Boers will result in more wars, the Boer Wars, if you will. Great Britain will win, and by 1910, Great Britain holdings will be combined with the Boer republics and joined in what is called the Union of South Africa. And this will be the beginning of an independent nation there in South Africa, but one with a very real European flavor in its leadership. something that will be, again, costly for those who are native to the continent. All of the resistance in Africa, only really Ethiopia is successful, as their leader Menelik II is skillfully able to plot Europeans versus one another to prevent them from controlling his kingdom. So, what are the effects of imperialism? Let's look first at the positive effects. Local warfare will go down. Obviously, they're going to stop fighting each other as this new enemy, the Europeans, comes on the scene. Better sanitation, perhaps, with improved health. Educational opportunities will improve literacy. However, you got to understand that these will be opportunities by the Europeans, and these institutions will not be Africa-centered. And after the Europeans leave in the 20th century, you're really going to find a very unprepared population for implementation or being able to interact with the rest of the world educationally. Also, the engaged resources extraction in the global economies. Africa is going to be involved in the global economy, but again, this is going to be European-centered, European-structured. So the infrastructures that will be built and maintained will be secured by European forces. And when the Europeans leave, upkeep of these infrastructures as well as management of them will be very dangerous. Negative effects, which are very recognizable. Africa will lose control of its future, not just in charge anymore. Combine that with the impacts of the 4 centuries they experienced of the slave trade, and you get really a continent that is going to have difficulty finding capable leaders to solve problems. Disease will also have an impact on Africa, not as much as it did in the Americas, and as much as Europeans are coming to Africa, but disease is still going to have an impact. Death by war will definitely be a huge deal. Conflicts with Europeans obviously leads to a lot of bloodshed and a lot of Africans dying. Also, the emphasis on cash crops will change agricultural patterns. So as communities that are creating fertile land and agricultural output changing over to cash crops, maybe there's not enough food to feed the populations. Perhaps the longest standing impact, though, has been on the breaking of traditional cultures and power sources with artificial borders. This becomes so problematic in the 20th century as Africans are gaining their independence. They're unprepared to take control of themselves, and this will lead to resurgence of internal conflicts amongst native tribes that have really been at odds with one another for centuries. So, as we look at different ways to control, as we look at other places around the world in our next video, not just Africa, understand that there's some different ways that these Europeans are going to be inserting their power and control on these imperial holdings. First is the colony, like the Americas. When we studied American colonization, you're going to be governed by a foreign power. Then there's the protectorate. This is like Great Britain's control perhaps over West Africa, maybe even the U.S. control over Puerto Rico. This is where a territory has its own government, but that government is really under the control of a foreign power. Then there's the sphere of influence, like you might find in China during this age. This is where territory has foreign power claiming trade rights, or really an economic access to that region. And then there's actually economic imperialism. This is where an independent country is controlled by the business of a foreign power. For example, Hawaii during the 1800s had a strong presence of the Dole Fruit Company, an American-based company, and their money was really driving forces of decision-making in Hawaii. So some of these are direct, some of these indirect. So if they are indirect, the existing political leaders are being used for the region and they're being manipulated. If it's direct, it is paternalistic, meaning the outside forces are coming in and acting as a father figure and assimilating their culture into this land. Both of them have consequences, and not always good ones. So as we wrap up in our next video about the other places where imperialism is shown, we're really setting a stage here for even more conflict that's going to explode in the 20th century.